When the old clock in Sir Reginald Fenton's manor struck 2 for the last time that night, no one knew that within moments a body would lie cold and a secret, buried for decades, would rise again. This was not just a murder, it was a game of deception, and whoever had made the first move believed they had already won, but the real story was only just beginning. The morning sun stretched long fingers over the sleepy village of St. Mary's Hollow, spilling golden light onto the damp cobblestones and timbered cottages still glistening with the remnants of night's mist. The shutters of bakeries and bookshops clattered open, a milk cart trundled down the high street, and the driver's cheery whistle cut through the crisp air, but beneath the familiar rhythms of morning, an unnatural hush settled, as if the village itself held its breath. Then the first whispers spread. Sir Reginald Fenton was dead. The revelation struck like a lightning bolt through the stillness, shattering the fragile quiet. The blacksmith's hammer froze mid-swing, its echo ringing hollow. At the post office, Miss Gertrude Winch and Mrs. Tibbs exchanged glances, laced with unspoken speculation. At the Grand Fenton Manor, where silence had long been synonymous with control, Catherine Fenton stepped into the study, the click of her heels swallowed by the heavy expectant air. There, slumped in his great leather chair, Sir Reginald stared past the window, his lifeless gaze fixed upon something beyond the morning mist. His breakfast tray sat untouched, a single strip of sunlight cutting across the chaos of scattered papers on his desk. No signs of struggle, no wounds, only the finality of death, and an absence that carried its own weight of mystery. The housekeeper, hovering in the doorway, spoke in hushed tones. "Doctor's been and gone, miss," she murmured. "Says it looks natural," but the hesitation in her voice suggested otherwise. Catherine pressed a handkerchief to her lips, masking not grief, but something colder. Later, when the family gathered, the air in the study grew thick with something unspoken, an anticipation not of mourning, but of revelation. The lawyer, Frederick Harris, shuffled the pages of the will, his fingers twitching as though they too wished to conceal something. At first, the reading followed expectations, small sums to distant relatives, generous provisions for the staff, but then, Harris's voice faltered. "To my distant relative, Arthur Fenton," he read, "I leave the sum of £100,000 conditional upon the recovery of the Fenton family heirloom, the Emerald Star." A silence heavier than grief fell. Catherine's knuckles turned white against the polished wood of the table. "The Emerald Star," a cousin scoffed. "That's a ghost story," but no one laughed. Harris's gaze flickered toward Catherine, lingered for a breath too long, then darted away. "It is nevertheless stated in Sir Reginald's final testament," he murmured. Catherine's composure did not falter, but beneath it, unease stirred. The Emerald Star, whispered of in family legend, long vanished, dismissed as myth, yet now resurrected, and tied to a fortune large enough to turn whispers into accusations. As the gathering dispersed, Frederick Harris took a brisk walk to his office in the village, the wind biting against his coat as if urging him forward. He unlocked the door with fumbling fingers, stepped into the dimly lit space, and poured himself a drink. Eventful reading, his secretary, Mrs. Forsyth, asked dryly from the doorway. Harris stared at the whiskey in his hand, then downed it in one sharp motion. "Eventful enough," he muttered. Mrs. Forsyth, never one to shy from scandal, tilted her head. "People are already talking. They say Sir Reginald was being blackmailed before he died." Harris scoffed, but the ice in his glass rattled as his hand trembled. A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Harris flinched. Mrs. Forsyth opened it to reveal Catherine Fenton, breathless, eyes dark with something unreadable. "Mr. Harris," she said, stepping inside, "I believe we need to talk." As Catherine Fenton pushed the office door shut behind her, a strange mix of satisfaction and unease settled over her. Harris's hand still trembled slightly, as if haunted by old memories or the weight of some unspoken guilt, but no one could have predicted that just hours later, this very man would be found dead in a locked room. His death not just a tragedy, but a puzzle wrapped in silence, a secret that refused to stay buried. That morning, as the dim light of St. Mary's Hollow cast a pale shroud over the village, a maid's piercing scream shattered the town's routine. Harris was discovered slumped over his desk, his lifeless hand gripping a pen, as though he had been in the midst of writing when death took him. The office door was bolted from the inside, the windows locked tight, and everything in its place, an impossible crime, as if death had arrived unseen, leaving no trace but its final mark. Inspector Crawley arrived at the scene, his expression etched with deep suspicion. "A classic locked room mystery," he muttered to the constable, who scribbled uselessly in his notebook, only to stare at the blank page, baffled. "No one in, no one out, yet here lies a dead man." Crawley stepped forward, surveying the scene. The desk held only a few papers, an inkwell, and a closed book, simple, ordinary things that now stood witness to an extraordinary crime. But what struck him most was Harris's rigid hand, clutching a pen so tightly it seemed as though he had died mid-thought. What had he been writing? Or had he even been writing at all? Crawley picked up the pen, but the nib was dry. "That means he died before he could write anything," Crawley murmured. The constable nodded, but his fidgeting betrayed his nerves. "Sir, look at this." He pointed toward the floor near the door, a faint, almost imperceptible line of white chalk dust. Crawley crouched, frowning. "Chalk? Here? Why?" But before an answer could surface, another voice cut through the air, a soft cough, a knowing smile, and the unmistakable presence of Miss Jane Marple, standing at the doorway, as if she had been expected. "So another puzzle," she remarked in her gentle yet shrewd tone, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. "And Inspector Crawley, if we truly wish to understand this death, I believe we must look beyond this room. We must look at the village itself." Crawley exhaled deeply, turning back to the lifeless figure at the desk. This was no simple death. This was a stone dropped into deep waters, its ripples spreading far beyond the walls of this office, and the real mystery was just beginning. The morning air hung heavy over the village, its usual quiet shattered by murmurs of scandal and death. As the carriage rolled to a stop outside the late lawyer's home, Clive Harris stepped out, his sharp features betraying neither sorrow nor shock, but something colder, calculation. His dark hair was tousled from the journey, his stiff movements betraying exhaustion, but his eyes, those sharp, watchful eyes, remained guarded. "I was in London," he stated when questioned, his voice as flat as the damp cobblestones beneath his feet. "Arrived this morning when I heard the news." Inspector Crawley studied him, his keen gaze searching for cracks. "You and your father were not close," he observed, his words measured. Clive let out a humorless chuckle. "You hear correctly. We had differences, but I didn't wish him dead." From her quiet corner Miss Marple observed. His stance, his tone, they spoke of something unspoken but not necessarily guilt. When Crawley pressed further, Clive merely shook his head. "Ask anyone in London. I was there all night." The inspector leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing. "Perhaps you have nothing to hide, Mr. Harris, but someone clearly does. A locked room suggests one of two things. Either your father was hiding something himself, or someone made sure he'd never speak again." Miss Marple's voice, gentle yet firm, barely rose above a murmur. "People rarely lock doors for their own benefit, don't you think?" By the following morning, Miss Marple and Crawley stood in the Harris residence once more, the household staff gathered like uneasy witnesses awaiting judgment. The head maid, Caroline Davis, twisted her apron as she answered, her voice tight with apprehension. "I was in the kitchen, sir, didn't hear a thing. Mr. Harris came home as usual, went straight to his office. I never saw him again." Crawley's gaze remained steady. "And no one else entered the house?" Caroline hesitated, the pause stretching too long. "Not that I saw," she whispered, avoiding his eyes. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice soothing. "My dear, you seem frightened. Is it the inspector's questions that worry you, or something else?" Caroline blinked rapidly, her composure slipping. "It's just, Mr. Harris wasn't always easy to work for, and now with him gone, I don't know if I'll even have a job tomorrow." Crawley shot Miss Marple a glance, but she merely smiled. "Fear of uncertainty often makes people appear more guilty than they are," she mused. "I do not believe Miss Davis has anything to hide." Relief washed over the maid's face, though her hands still trembled. Later that afternoon, Henry Wallace, Sir Reginald's longtime business partner, was summoned. He arrived with his usual air of importance, his well-tailored suit pressed to perfection, but the moment the conversation turned to the disputed will, his confidence wavered. "I wasn't aware of any unusual clauses," Wallace admitted. "Sir Reginald kept those matters private. The Emerald Star, that's as much a surprise to me as to anyone else." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression unreadable, surprised but not concerned. Wallace's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" "Well," she said lightly, "your business partner's lawyer was found dead, and yet you seem composed." Her words, though softly spoken, landed like a hammer. Wallace stiffened. "There's no use in panicking, is there?" "No," Miss Marple agreed, her smile thin. "Though in moments of panic, people tend to reveal their true selves." Wallace said nothing. Crawley noted the tension, his pencil scratching against his notebook. As the sun dipped lower that evening, Crawley and Miss Marple stood at the edge of the Harris estate. "No one saw Harris after the will reading," she murmured. "No one, except perhaps someone who didn't wish to be seen." Crawley frowned. "You think someone entered unseen, killed him, and locked the door behind them?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted to a faint scuff mark near the office's threshold. "Locked doors don't always mean what we think," she said. "Sometimes they're meant to keep secrets in, rather than people out." Beyond them, atop its lonely hill, Fenton Manor loomed, its ivy-covered stone walls standing resolute against the deepening dusk. To the untrained eye, it was nothing more than a grand old house, steeped in wealth and history, but Miss Marple knew better. Behind those walls, the Fenton family was holding its collective breath. Sir Reginald was gone, his lawyer was dead, and somewhere within that house lay the answer, a truth someone was willing to kill for. On a cold evening, as a thin mist settled over Followridge Hall, Evelyn Graves arrived. Her sharp gaze and measured tone betrayed no emotion, yet she could sense the stories lingering within these walls. The master of the house, Edgar Whitmore, a renowned yet reserved lawyer, had been found dead in his study just days ago, the door locked from the inside, with only a single dim light burning. The eerie silence of the room was broken only by the steady ticking of the clock. It didn't take Evelyn long to realize this was no ordinary murder. When she picked up the half-empty whiskey glass from the desk, she noticed something peculiar. The liquid was undisturbed, save for a few strands floating near the surface, as if the drinker had suffered a shock before taking a sip. But that wasn't all. An old journal, presumably Edgar's, lay open on a shelf, its last page bearing only two cryptic words, "Emerald Shadow." The phrase alone was enough to hint at a long-buried secret. Evelyn set the journal back in its place, but as she moved toward the door, she noticed a faint scratch near the lock, a subtle but telling mark. Was this truly a case of a locked room murder, or just a carefully crafted illusion? The real problem was that the evidence told an old tale. There had only been two other people in the house that night. Edgar's niece Eleanor, who had returned from London just days ago, and his longtime confidant, Arthur Langley, a man whose unease was difficult to ignore. "Eleanor," Evelyn asked in a measured voice, "when exactly did you return from London?" A flicker of something unreadable crossed Eleanor's face, but her response was steady. "A day before, after I received a strange letter from Edgar." Arthur, ever composed but visibly wary of further questioning, added, Edgar was gathering a few old documents. He wanted to settle a case from years ago. But what could that have to do with the Emerald Shadow? Evelyn was beginning to see the bigger picture. This wasn't just about a legal matter, it was about a deeply buried truth. Her eyes caught something on the floor, a small antique keychain, possibly from an old and valuable lock. Was the Emerald Shadow an object, a secret, or merely a deception? She needed just one answer now. Had Edgar been trying to erase the last traces of a long-hidden secret? Or had someone else made sure that secret was buried with him? The heavy mahogany doors of Whitmore House loomed as Evelyn Finch stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of aged paper and polished wood. She moved with quiet precision, her gloved fingers tracing the edges of a desk that had once belonged to the late Arthur Whitmore, a man whose death had left more questions than answers. The house was unnervingly still, as if waiting for secrets to unravel themselves. A flickering candle on the mantel cast jagged shadows across the study, illuminating a pile of correspondence left in apparent haste. Evelyn's eyes sharpened as she sifted through the papers, stopping at an aged sheet, its corners curled with time. The ink, though faded, was unmistakably Arthur's, the same meticulous script he had used for decades. The letter mentioned a legal dispute over an artifact known as the Whitmore relic, an heirloom that had been absent from family records for years. Yet, someone had been seeking it relentlessly. The recipient's name, however, had been viciously scratched out. Setting the letter aside, Evelyn's gaze swept the room, noting a faint indentation in the thick carpet near the bookshelf. Something had been moved. She knelt, running her fingers along the base, until she found a nearly imperceptible groove. With measured force, she pressed, and the panel gave way just enough to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside lay a folded note, its creases deep, as though it had been clutched tightly in fear. Unfolding it, she read the hurried scrawl, "They must never know. Burn everything." The weight of the message settled over her like a chill. Someone had been desperate to keep the past buried, but why? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden creak of the floorboards behind her. She turned to find Richard Sterling leaning against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be here, Miss Finch," he murmured, though there was no real force behind the words. "Neither should you," she countered smoothly. His eyes flicked toward the open compartment, and for the briefest moment, his carefully guarded demeanor wavered. Evelyn had seen that look before, the look of a man standing at the edge of something dangerous. Before he could speak, the clock in the hallway chimed, its echo carrying through the vast house like a ghostly reminder of time slipping away. Richard took a step forward, his voice lower now. "Arthur was hiding something, and someone out there doesn't want us to find it." Evelyn studied him for a moment, before turning her attention back to the letter. The Whitmore relic was no mere trinket. It was a thread leading to something far darker, and as she glanced at the flickering candle, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The towering silhouette of Blackthorn Manor stood solemn against the dying light of the evening, its grand windows hollow and unseeing, like the empty sockets of a long-dead spectre. Evelyn Finch tightened her coat against the biting chill as she stepped onto the gravel path, her footsteps muffled against the hush of the encroaching night. The letter that had arrived hours ago still burned in her pocket, a cryptic note sealed with the same wax insignia as the late Arthur Whitmore's estate. "Look where the past was buried, before it is erased forever." No signature, no explanation, only urgency. She had seen enough cryptic warnings in her years, as an investigator, to know when a secret was on the verge of vanishing. The front doors groaned open under the weight of time and disuse, revealing the cavernous entryway beyond. A dim chandelier flickered overhead, its feeble glow illuminating dust motes that danced in the heavy air. The house had been untouched since Whitmore's sudden passing, or so it should have been. A scent lingered, faint, acrid, and misplaced, like the last whisper of burnt paper. Someone had been here recently, and they had been in a hurry, Evelyn's gloved fingers brushed against the wooden railing as she ascended the grand staircase, her mind tracing the last known steps of Arthur Whitmore. His death had been ruled an accident, an unfortunate misstep down these very stairs. But accidents rarely came with the shadow of a missing ledger, and the peculiar vanishing of a decades-old artifact. Whitmore had spent his final weeks obsessed with something, locked away in his study, sifting through records that had remained untouched for generations. The Emerald Writ, the whispered legend of a document capable of unraveling the very foundation of the Whitmore inheritance. And now, both he and the document were gone. At the end of the hall, the study door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling into the corridor. Evelyn pushed it open, her eyes scanning the room with practiced precision. Papers lay scattered across the massive oak desk, the wax seal of the Whitmore family broken and discarded among them. But it was the fireplace that held her attention. Among the smoldering embers, blackened fragments of parchment curled and crumbled, their words lost to the flames, except for one. A half-burnt page had escaped complete destruction, its ink still legible at the edges. It must be hidden before they come for it. The writ must not fall into their hands. Evelyn's pulse quickened. Whitmore had known he was being watched, and he had tried to protect whatever truth he had uncovered. But someone had gotten to him first. The sharp creak of a floorboard sent a ripple of tension down her spine. She turned sharply, catching the reflection of movement in the study's grand mirror. Not a trick of the dim light, not a phantom of imagination. Someone else was here, watching, waiting. The house, it seemed, was not as empty as it appeared. The moon cast a pale glow over the Holloway estate, its once proud spires now shrouded in creeping ivy and the weight of untold secrets. Inspector Evelyn Graves moved through the vast empty halls, her gloved fingers trailing over dust-laden furniture. The letter that had summoned her to this decaying monument of old wealth sat crumpled in her coat pocket, its cryptic message gnawing at the edges of her mind. It was never lost, only waiting to be claimed. Her footsteps echoed as she reached the great study, where the fire had long since died, leaving behind the scent of charred parchment and the remnants of something hastily discarded. A ledger lay open on the desk, its yellowed pages filled with accounts of debts repaid and fortunes siphoned away. But one entry stood apart, its ink bolder, fresher. Vault 3, the Holloway legacy. Evelyn's pulse quickened. Vaults meant secrecy, and secrecy meant someone had something to hide. The estate's underground chambers were rarely spoken of, but she had heard whispers of betrayals sealed behind iron doors, of inheritances that were more curse than blessing. She descended the spiral staircase, the air growing thick with the scent of damp stone and forgotten history. At the end of the corridor, a door loomed before her, its brass handle tarnished with time. With a firm push, it groaned open, revealing rows of crumbling shelves and locked chests, each labeled with names long erased by time. In the dim lantern light, something gleamed, an ornate lockbox, its gold filigree catching the flickering glow. She knelt, fingers brushing against the cool metal, when a sudden creak behind her sent a jolt through her spine. A figure stood in the doorway, half shrouded in shadow. Lord Victor Holloway. His expression was unreadable, his posture rigid. "I expected someone would come looking eventually," he murmured. Evelyn rose slowly, the lockbox cradled in her hands. "You knew what was down here." "Of course, but knowing and finding are two different things." He stepped closer, his gaze flicking toward the box with something between dread and desire. "That doesn't belong to you." Evelyn arched a brow. "And yet you left it here buried beneath decades of dust." "Some things should remain buried," he said, voice tight. "For everyone's sake." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unsaid truths. Evelyn set the box down on a nearby table, and with deliberate care, flipped open the latch. Inside, nestled among yellowed documents, lay a single object, an obsidian pendant, its surface marred by scratches, its edges worn smooth by time. And beneath it a note, the ink still stark against the brittle paper. Return it, before it's too late. Victor exhaled sharply, his hand gripping the back of a chair. You don't understand, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. That pendant isn't just jewelry, it's a claim. To what? Evelyn pressed. To the Holloway fortune. His eyes met hers, dark and unreadable. To something far worse. A noise echoed from the corridor, the sound of hurried footsteps. Someone else was coming. The walls of Holloway Estate had kept their secrets long enough, but tonight one of them would finally be unearthed. The drawing room of Blackthorn Manor held the weight of too many whispered grievances, its dark wood panels swallowing the afternoon light, its heavy drapes failing to keep out the scent of rain on old stone. Inspector Evelyn Hargrove stood before the cold hearth, turning a small tarnished key over in her fingers. Across from her, Jonathan Pembroke sat rigid, his knuckles white against the arms of his chair. You found it, he said at last, though there was no relief in his voice. I did. Evelyn lifted her gaze. The Blackthorn seal, your father's most prized possession. Jonathan exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. He believed it to be the foundation of our legacy, a symbol that the Pembroke name would never fade into obscurity. Evelyn studied him, and yet it vanished. Because it was meant to, Jonathan muttered. His fingers drummed against the polished wood of the chair. That seal, it wasn't just an heirloom, it was a shackle. My father used it as a weapon, binding everyone to his will. If you displeased him, you lost any claim to the estate. No inheritance, no future, just a name stripped from the records. Evelyn tilted her head. That must have been difficult, watching him wield it over you all. A bitter smile tugged at Jonathan's lips. Difficult? You have no idea. We were all just chess pieces to him. He never intended to let any of us win. His gaze flickered to the key in Evelyn's hands. Where did you find it? In the old chapel, she said. Beneath the floorboards, tucked away as if someone wanted it forgotten. Jonathan stiffened. My father would never have hidden it. That seal was his pride. Exactly, Evelyn said softly. So the question is, who wanted it gone? A creak sounded behind them. Both turned as Abigail Pembroke stepped into the room, her pale hands clasped tightly before her. That would be me, she whispered. Jonathan shot to his feet. You? Her chin lifted, defiance in her gaze. You think I could stand by and let him use it to control us forever? Her voice wavered, but her resolve did not. He never let you leave, Jonathan. He never let me marry. Everything we did was dictated by that wretched seal. So I took it, I hid it where no one would look. And for a while we were free. Evelyn turned the key between her fingers. But now it's back. Abigail's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. And now we're not. Silence fell heavy between them, broken only by the distant chime of the grandfather clock in the hall. Jonathan's hands clenched at his sides. Then we burn it, he said at last. Abigail's breath hitched. Evelyn said nothing. The Blackthorn seal had dictated their lives, but now it was in their hands. A single moment of choice stood between them, and the past that had always ruled them. And whatever decision they made, someone would regret it. The dim glow of the study's lone desk lamp cast elongated shadows across the worn leather-bound books, the air thick with the scent of old ink, and something more elusive, secrets left to fester. Thomas Whitmore stood near the fireplace, hands buried deep in his pockets, his posture rigid as if bracing for a blow. Across from him, Inspector Helena Graves studied him with her usual, unsettling calm. It must be difficult, she murmured, her voice soft yet deliberate. Your father's will, the estate, the missing artifact. It's all tangled together, isn't it? Thomas exhaled sharply, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. Difficult? Try suffocating. He was never really gone, not even in death. Every decision I made, every breath I took, I could feel him looming over me, waiting for me to falter. He turned, his fingers ghosting over the edge of the desk, its polished surface reflecting the dim light. And now, even from the grave, he still holds the reins. Helena tilted her head. He left you something, didn't he? A portion of the inheritance, just enough to remind you that you were never truly free. Thomas's jaw tightened, just enough to keep me on a leash. His fingers curled into a fist before he let out a slow breath, forcing himself to relax. He knew exactly what he was doing. Helena stepped forward, her gaze sharp. And yet you knew about the Whitmore sigil. You knew it existed, knew it was out there somewhere. That must have been tempting. Thomas stilled, his knuckles white against the desk. I heard the rumors. That it was hidden, that it held more than just sentimental value. I thought, if I found it, maybe for once I could do something on my own. His voice was hoarse, filled with something dangerously close to longing. You didn't want the sigil, Helena said, her tone unwavering. You wanted control. Independence. That's a different kind of power, isn't it? Silence stretched between them, heavy and unyielding. Thomas turned toward the window, staring into the storm that had begun to gather outside. Not that it matters now, he muttered. It was never about the sigil, it was about him. And he's still winning. Helena watched him for a moment longer, before stepping back, her expression unreadable. Perhaps, she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, but only if you let him. The words hung in the air as she turned toward the study door. Meanwhile, in the grand library of Whitmore Manor, dust motes swirled in the slanted light, the faint scent of aged parchment and pipe tobacco, lingering in the silence. Helena moved with calculated precision, her fingers trailing along the rows of tomes, past the towering shelves lined with forgotten history. There, amid the untouched pages and heavy wooden cabinets, was a single locked drawer. She knelt, running her fingers along its edges, sensing something out of place. With a quiet exhale, she retrieved a small brass key from her pocket, the one she had found tucked inside Thomas's father's old pocket watch. The lock clicked open, revealing a bundle of yellowed papers and a sealed envelope, the inked name still crisp against the parchment. To Jonathan Fenwick, the name was unfamiliar, yet the way it had been tucked away, hidden in a place meant to be forgotten, spoke volumes. Helena's fingers hesitated over the wax seal, a frown tugging at the corners of her lips. This letter had been meant for someone, a message left unsent, perhaps never meant to be found. And yet, here it was, trembling in her grasp like a ghost from the past. Behind her, a floorboard creaked. She turned sharply, her breath steady, her instincts razor-sharp. The storm outside had begun to rage, and inside the silent manor, someone was watching. The heavy silence in Whitmore Manor's study was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. Inspector Helena Graves moved with careful precision, her gloved fingers skimming the polished wood of the writing desk before settling on the faintest scuff marks near the base, so subtle they were nearly invisible. You're certain this ties back to the sigil? Lord Richard Halewell scoffed from his place near the window, arms crossed in a show of skepticism. It was just an old trinket my father obsessed over. Helena turned, her expression unreadable. And yet, it was important enough to kill for. The words sent an uneasy ripple through the room. Inspector Everett Dunn, standing near the door, shifted his weight, rubbing his chin in thought. The lock wasn't tampered with. No forced entry. So how did the murderer escape? Helena allowed a small, knowing smile. They never used the door. Moving toward the towering bookshelves lining the far wall, she ran her fingers along the spines of well-worn tomes until she found what she was looking for, a nearly imperceptible seam in the wood, a trick of craftsmanship designed to conceal rather than reveal. With a soft push, a section of the panel gave way, swinging inward with a quiet creak. A narrow passage yawned before them, swallowing the light. "Good Lord," Everett muttered, a hidden corridor. Helena stepped aside, allowing the others to take in the sight. Not just any corridor, a direct path leading to the east wing. Whoever killed Lord Whitmore didn't slip in unnoticed. They walked through a passage known only to those with deep ties to this house. Richard's face paled, his bravado wavering. "But that means yes," Helena cut in smoothly. "The murderer was one of you." Later that evening, as the heavy drapes of night fell over the manor, Helena called the key players into the drawing room. Lady Evelyn Whitmore sat near the fire, her fingers twisting in the folds of her gown. Richard stood stiffly by the liquor cabinet, his usual air of arrogance dulled by unease. Near the far wall, Julian Fenton, the estate's longtime financial advisor, stared at the ground, his expression blank. In the corner, Thomas Whitmore leaned against a bookcase, his hand absently clutching his father's old pocket watch. Helena let the silence stretch, studying each of them before finally speaking. "The truth has a way of revealing itself," she began, her voice calm yet commanding. "And tonight, we will uncover it." No one moved, no one breathed. "The Whitmore sigil was never just a family heirloom," Helena continued. "It was a symbol of power, leverage, a weapon wielded by Lord Whitmore against those who served him. And someone in this room decided that weapon needed to be buried, along with him." The room seemed to shrink under the weight of her words. Evelyn's knuckles whitened against the armrest. Julian shifted ever so slightly. Richard's fingers tightened around the crystal tumbler in his hand. Helena's gaze was sharp as a blade. The passage in his study, someone used it that night. Someone who knew his routines, his secrets. And someone who knew exactly what he was planning to reveal about the sigil. A flicker of something, fear, realization, flashed across Thomas's face, but he quickly schooled his features. "What are you suggesting, Inspector?" "I'm suggesting," Helena said smoothly, "that Lord Whitmore's death wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was a premeditated act. And the sigil, wherever it is, holds the final piece of this puzzle." The room held its breath. Somewhere in the manor, a clock chimed the hour, and then finally the first thread of the tangled web began to unravel. "You aren't implying, Inspector," Lord Hailwell began, his voice tight with disbelief. Helena Graves' expression remained calm, yet there was an unmistakable finality in her tone. "Not implying, Lord Hailwell, I'm stating it outright. I know who killed Lord Whitmore, and I know why." The room tensed as Julian Fenton straightened in his chair, his arms still folded across his chest, masking the unease in his posture. "And who would that be, Inspector?" Helena turned her gaze toward Evelyn Whitmore. "It was you, Lady Whitmore." A hush fell over the study. The fire crackled in the hearth, throwing flickering shadows against the walls, but the room itself had turned to ice. Evelyn's fingers clenched around the armrests of her chair, her knuckles pale against the polished wood. "That's preposterous." "Is it?" Helena's voice was steady, gentle, but inescapable. "You had the most to lose if Lord Whitmore's secret came to light. His will ensured that should the Whitmore sigil remain lost, you would retain control of his estate. But when your husband discovered its whereabouts and planned to reveal it, he became an obstacle, didn't he?" A small gasp escaped the lips of one of the onlookers, but Evelyn's expression remained poised, her voice controlled. "You have no proof." Helena stepped closer, her eyes sharp with certainty. "On the contrary, your husband confided in someone before his death. He was being blackmailed by someone who knew exactly what the sigil represented, a symbol not of wealth but of leverage. He was being pressured to keep its history buried, and when he refused, he became a liability. You, Lady Whitmore, had the knowledge, the motive, and the means to silence him." Julian Fenton scoffed, shifting uneasily. "This is absurd. My lady has no reason to." "Did she not?" Helena's gaze turned to him, unflinching. "You played your part as well, Mr. Fenton. You worked alongside Lady Whitmore to keep the sigil from being found, to maintain control over the estate. But when Lord Whitmore refused to be manipulated any longer, when he decided to reveal the truth, Lady Whitmore had to act. Evelyn rose suddenly, her voice unsteady for the first time. "This is nonsense. I would never—" "You knew about the hidden passage," Helena interrupted, her voice soft but firm. "The one behind the bookshelves in his study. It gave you the perfect opportunity to strike without ever using the door, to kill him and disappear without a trace. And now you have no way out of this." The silence that followed was suffocating. Julian's hand trembled slightly at his side. Richard Halewell's face darkened with realization. Evelyn stood frozen, her expression unreadable, her breath shallow, and then, ever so slightly, her shoulders sagged. Inspector Everett Dunn stepped forward, warrant in hand, his voice steady. "Lady Evelyn Whitmore, you are under arrest for the murder of Lord Whitmore." She did not resist. There was no desperate denial, no outburst of emotion. The fight had left her. She had gambled everything on secrecy, and lost. As the inspector led her from the room, Helena turned toward the window, her hands lightly clasped in front of her. Outside, the manor loomed against the darkened sky, unchanged by the truth that had unraveled within its walls. But for those left in the study, the weight of it lingered. The Whitmore sigil had cost more than gold, it had cost a life, and now at last its story had come to an end. Escorted through the grand corridors of Whitmore Manor, past the towering oil portraits of long-dead ancestors, Lady Evelyn Whitmore walked with slow, deliberate steps, her spine unyielding, her face an unreadable mask. The walls, lined with memories of generations before her, seemed to close in, heavy with the weight of the past. The heavy oak doors loomed ahead, and the echo of her own footsteps on the polished marble floor felt deafening. Just before stepping through, she hesitated, turning her head ever so slightly. Her gaze met Helena Graves's, and for the briefest moment a flicker of something broke through the cold exterior. Defiance, yes, but also something deeper, heavier. Resignation. A realization, perhaps, that the game she had played so carefully had finally unraveled, that the world she had constructed with such precision was now crumbling beyond repair. The fight had left her. The game was over. As the constables led her into the night, the heavy doors groaned shut behind her, leaving only the echoes of her downfall hanging in the air. The grand hall seemed emptier, the light dimmer, as if the manor itself had exhaled, relieved of a burden it had carried too long. Helena exhaled softly, her eyes drifting to Julian Fenton, who stood stiffly by the fire, his usual air of arrogance subdued by the weight of what had transpired. The golden glow of the embers cast long shadows across his face, making the sharp lines of his features appear almost gaunt. He had kept his distance during the arrest, his face unreadable, but his fingers twitched slightly as he stared at the dying flames. There was something unspoken in his posture, relief perhaps, but also grief. "Did you know?" Helena's voice was quiet, lacking accusation, merely seeking the truth. "About your mother's involvement?" Julian hesitated, his jaw tightening before he finally nodded. "I suspected," he admitted, voice low, almost lost in the crackling of the fire. "It wasn't difficult. She had a way of controlling things, of making sure the past stayed buried." He shook his head. "I never thought she'd go that far." Helena regarded him steadily. "Sometimes the things we refuse to see are the ones staring us in the face. You spent years resenting your father, believing him to be the true tyrant, but perhaps, just perhaps, the chains around you were not of his making alone." His expression wavered for a moment, something fragile creeping into his usually guarded features. He opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. A shadow of realization flickered across his face. "I suppose, I didn't want to know," he murmured. "I wanted to hate him, it was easier that way." He let out a bitter laugh, devoid of warmth, but maybe it wasn't all him. Maybe she. He stopped, shaking his head, as if unwilling to finish the thought. Not that it matters now. Helena studied him for a long moment, before offering a small knowing smile. It matters, Mr. Fenton, but what you do with that truth, that's up to you. She touched his arm lightly, a fleeting gesture of understanding, before turning away, leaving him to the weight of his own thoughts. The room felt colder in her absence, as if something vital had left with her. Julian remained by the fire, staring into the embers, his thoughts a tangled mess of past and present, truth and illusion. Later, in the depths of the Whitmore vault, the air was damp with age, the scent of stone and earth clinging to the silence. The vault had been untouched for years, hidden beneath layers of dust and secrecy, but now it stood exposed once more. At its heart, resting within a locked glass case, was the sigil, the object that had set everything in motion. The emerald gleamed under the dim lantern light, its deep green depths betraying nothing of the blood that had been spilled over it. The gold filigree, intricately carved with symbols lost to time, curled around the edges, like vines grasping at something unseen. Once it had been a thing of legend, a whispered secret among the elite, a relic of power, but now, after all that had been lost, it seemed smaller. Helena stood at the threshold, watching as the estate trustees secured it behind reinforced glass, locking it away, as if that could somehow contain the destruction it had caused. The room felt eerily silent, as if even the walls knew the weight of what had happened. Beside her, an elderly man, one of the estate's long-time caretakers, adjusted his spectacles and sighed. "Strange, isn't it?" he mused. "Something so small, so elegant, capable of causing so much ruin." Helena nodded, her gaze fixed on the sigil's cold gleam. "It's always the same," she said softly. "Objects themselves aren't dangerous. It's what people see in them. The power, the leverage that makes them deadly." The man gave a tired smile. "And now," Helena exhaled, crossing her arms, "now, it's just a relic again." But even as she said it, she knew better. Relics never stayed buried forever. The sprawling estate of Ravenshire stood in brooding silence as the last vestiges of daylight melted into the horizon, casting elongated shadows over the ancient grounds. The towering spires loomed over the land like silent sentinels, their cold stone facades steeped in centuries of whispered betrayals and hidden transgressions. The air, thick with the mingling scents of damp earth and burning wood from the distant village chimneys, carried a stillness that belied the storm that had just passed. Helena Graves emerged from the vault's arched doorway, her steps slow, measured, as though she carried the weight of all that had transpired within those cold, confining walls. Her gloved fingers trailed along the iron railing of the stone stairway leading to the grand hall, a subtle tremor in her breath betraying the finality of the moment. Behind her, locked beneath thick glass, the obsidian pendant, small, unassuming, and yet the harbinger of ruin, sat upon its velvet cushion, forever imprisoned as if mere glass and iron could contain the darkness it had wrought. Helena knew better. Artifacts themselves were never the cause of such destruction. It was what they represented, the power they held over men's hearts, that turned them into catalysts of disaster. And this pendant, an heirloom that had been passed down through generations, hidden away, stolen, lost, and now reclaimed, had claimed more than its fair share of souls. Inside the grand hall, the heavy chandeliers cast golden reflections upon the polished floors, their light struggling to touch the darkened corners of the vast room. The portraits of the Lancaster lineage lined the walls, their painted eyes frozen in a perpetual gaze of judgment. How many of them, Helena wondered, had been aware of the secrets buried within this estate? How many had played their part in weaving the intricate web of lies that had finally unraveled tonight? The truth, as it always did, had a way of clawing itself free, no matter how deeply it had been buried. In the far corner of the room, William Lancaster sat in silence, his posture rigid, his fingers tightening around the glass of untouched brandy in his grasp. His face, usually composed, was drawn with an emotion he could no longer suppress, resignation, perhaps, or the slow, dawning realization of all he had lost. The weight of his family's sins had finally settled upon his shoulders. The grandeur, the prestige, the name that had once commanded so much reverence. What did it mean now? What was left when the illusions were stripped away? His mother's greed, his father's cowardice, his own blind devotion to the past, they had all led to this moment. And now, for all his wealth, for all his power, he was left with nothing but the echoes of what had been revealed. Helena did not speak to him as she passed, offering only a fleeting glance in his direction. There was nothing left to say. Justice would take its course, and Ravenshire would endure as it always had, standing firm against the tides of time. But its foundation had been shaken. Its walls, though standing, would forever carry the stains of the past. The night air was crisp as Helena stepped onto the cobblestone path leading away from the estate, the flickering lanterns casting long wavering shadows at her feet. The moors stretched endlessly before her, the rolling expanse bathed in the soft glow of the rising moon. The heather swayed in the cold breeze, whispering secrets only the wind could hear. She took the long road back to town, her steps unhurried, her mind still sifting through the tangled threads of the past weeks. Greed, jealousy, fear, these were the true architects of ruin. No amount of wealth, no title, nor inheritance could ever truly shield against them. Sir Edgar's obsession with the pendant's secrets, Margaret's desperate attempts to erase the past, William's unwillingness to see the truth, they had all played their roles in this tragedy. The pendant had been merely a symbol, a spark to an already smouldering fire. The real danger had always lain within the hearts of those who sought to control it. The village of Ashbury was silent as Helena reached its outskirts, its cobbled streets glistening faintly under the gaslights. The cottages, with their ivy-clad walls and warmly lit windows, exuded a deceptive tranquility. From behind lace curtains, shadows shifted as unseen eyes watched her pass. This town had always been a place of quiet whispers, of stories woven into its very foundation. Scandals were covered with polite smiles, but the soil here was loose, and the past had a habit of refusing to stay buried. She paused for a moment at the edge of the main street, glancing back in the direction of Ravenshire. The towering silhouette of the manor stood in the distance, its grandeur unshaken, but its spirit forever altered. A place like that did not forget. The walls had soaked in the echoes of what had transpired, and long after she had left, the whispers of the past would remain. Adjusting the buttons of her coat, Helena turned, her breath visible in the cool night air. The case was over, the guilty would answer for their sins, the pendant was back where it belonged. And yet, as she stepped through the quiet streets of Ashbury, she knew this town would not stay silent for long. It never did.